So we're continuing our trek through the book of Genesis. Last week we finished up chapter 20. And if you remember, at the end of Genesis 20 is where Abraham needed to pray for Abimelech because God had basically made the entire nation barren because Abimelech had taken Sarah and was about to marry her, even though, I mean, it was all an accident on Abimelech's part. But because she was part of God's plan, God had to stop it. And so he created this situation. Abraham prayed and God healed Abimelech and his nation. So just to recap a little bit more, back in chapter, good heavens, where was it? Chapter 18. Back in chapter 18, God shows up and he talks to Abraham, if you remember, while he's outside the tent. And God says, about this time next year, Sarah will have a son, right? Then we have the rest of chapter 18, where God's talking about Sodom. Chapter 19, where God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. Chapter 20, where Abraham moves to the land of the Philistines away from Sodom and Gomorrah. And now we have chapter 21, and in verse 1 it says, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken." So all of those events happened within a year. So a lot of times we have where in one chapter you can have many years go by. This is one of the places in the Bible where you have several chapters and it's all in a short period of time. And so it says that in verse 2 it says, "For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, and at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, 'God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me.' She also said, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age.'" So, in verse 1 it says, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he said." Just like he said. At the time that God said it would happen, it happened. All of these events happened within 1 year. And 1 year later, Sarah was giving birth to Isaac. And it says, she conceived and bore him a son in his old age. If God gives you a promise, it doesn't matter how outlandish it sounds. Sarah thought this was impossible. She had gone through menopause. It wasn't happening. And God said, "Yes, it is." And now she says, "God has made me laugh." He turned her laugh of doubt into laugh of joy. God can turn your circumstances around. You look at it and you laugh in doubt, and you're like, "Yeah, right, that's not going to happen." And then God does it for you, and he turns that laughter into, "God did it for me. It was impossible, but God did it." And that's what he did for Sarah. And of course, it shows that Abraham followed God's command. When Isaac was 8 days old, he was circumcised just like God told him. Shows that Abraham was still keeping what God had told him. God didn't have to tell him again. He did it because God told him way back when, a year ago, that this is what's supposed to happen. And so he circumcised his son. She says, "God has made me laugh, and all who hear it will laugh with me." Abraham was 100 years old, And according to chapter 8, 17, 19, actually it's chapter 17 where God gave the promise, not chapter 18. I was misquoting that, sorry. In chapter 17, Abraham questions God. He says, will a man who's 100 years old and a woman who's 90 years old have a kid? So we know how old Sarah was because Abraham, whenever God says, in a year, you're going to have a kid. And he's like, I'm going to be 100. That means Sarah's going to be 90. Will they have a kid? So Sarah had a child at the age of 90 after menopause, and she also nursed him. Who would have said that Sarah would nurse a child? Talk about miracles. Miracle, amazing miracle. She says, for I have borne him a son in his old age. I love the fact that she never says she's old. She says, I have borne him a son in his old age. No one thought he could do it. They had no doubts about me, though. So in verse 8, it moves on. It says, so the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. So I just wanted to throw this in there real quick. According to Jewish rabbinical tradition, weaning could take place anywhere between 18 months and 5 years of age. So this could have been just a year later. It could have been 4 years later, 5 years later. For instance, when did they take Samuel to Eli the priest? It says when he was weaned. Did they take him as a little bitty baby? Or was he a toddler? More than likely as a toddler, because it says his mom brought him robes every year. Little robes to make, little priestly robes. Could you imagine how cute they were? You know? And so Isaac was somewhere between year and a half to 5 years old. Probably about a toddler, just learning to walk, that kind of thing. And whenever he was weaned, Abraham has a celebration. He's like, my son is getting weaned. So we're having this big feast, throwing a big old party. And in verse 9, we see something else happen. It says, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abram, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. So during this party, Sarah looks over and sees Ishmael laughing. That word scoffing actually is straight out laughing. So you have the laughter of Sarah in doubt turned into the laughter of joy, of promise fulfilled. And now you have the laughter of derision and scoffing from the point of Ishmael. Ishmael's over there making fun of him, laughing. They're throwing this big old party just because he's not on milk anymore. He's eating solid food. That's hilarious. Notice how Sarah never names him. In fact, she doesn't even name Hagar. She goes to Abraham. See, she understands she is still under submission of Abraham. This is the amazing thing. She understands her role. She has the power of being the wife, but she understands that she's under submission to Abraham, the Lord of the house. And so she goes to Abraham and she says, you need to cast her out. Why? Because the son of this bondwoman is not going to try and fight for the inheritance that is my son's right. She had probably been waiting for this, thinking about this at least, for the last year and a half to 5 years. Going, what am I going to do? He has another son who's been raised as the heir for the last 14 years. And at the party, she sees him scoffing. She goes to Abraham. She says, look, this isn't going to work. You got to get rid of her. And Abraham didn't like the situation. Why? Because his son, he raised Ishmael as the heir. He loves Ishmael. I can't imagine the turmoil that Abraham had to go through to cast out this son that he loves. He was very distraught because of it. And in verse 12, it says, but God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called, yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman because he is your seed. God tells Abraham, listen to Sarah, your wife. A lot of times, this is where men have the problem. Because they get confused and they're not sure what they want to do. They're not sure what the will of God is. And then they don't listen to their wives. They're like, you know what? I'm supposed to be the head of the household. This is where submission becomes more of, I don't have to listen to you. For the men, because he says, you know what, I'm in charge of this house. I will do what I think is right. But he's really confused in his heart and he doesn't know what to do. And the wife is sitting there telling him, you know what, this is probably what you need to do. And he doesn't listen. God uses, there's a reason he made him a helper in the Garden of Eden. He didn't make a slave. He didn't make a mute woman for Adam. He made him a helper, someone to help him out. And men need to realize that the women in your life are there to help you. When you're confused, go to your wife. Ask her what she thinks. Ask her opinion. Because a lot of times God is going to direct her. And even whenever it feels very displeasing to you, sometimes you need to get over it and just listen to your wife. And that's what God told Abraham. He says, listen to your wife, the voice of your wife. Don't be distraught. Don't be distraught because of your son or because of your bondwoman. Don't feel distraught. He says, because I'm going to take care of them. In Isaac is who your name is going to go through. And isn't it interesting that Ishmael and his descendants are also just as much his descendants as Isaac, but they're not known as the children of Abraham. The Israelites are. He says, in Isaac your seed will be called. He says, but Ishmael is your child, and I will make of him a nation as well. Why? Because he's your son. And in verse 14, it's interesting whenever you start thinking about the promise of Abraham, because he kind of adopted Lot as a son. And we have the nations of Ammon and Moab from Lot. We have the nations of the Arabs through the Ishmael. We have the nations through all of the seeds of Abraham became nations. And that's what God's promise was to him. Every son that he had became another nation. And so in verse 14 it says, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and put it on her shoulder, gave it and the boy to Hagar, and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bowshot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. She sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. Abraham, probably with many tears and breaking heart, got some food together, put it in a bag, got a skin of water, gave it to Hagar, led Ishmael over, who was probably, like I said, about 14, said, you guys need to leave. Talk about heartbreaking. I can't imagine. I can't even begin to fathom this. Sends her away. So they start walking. They walk down into the land of Beersheba. Remember, they're still in the land of the Philistines. They're still down south near Egypt. I imagine she was probably walking towards Egypt. And they start wandering in there. The water was all used up. No more water. They were probably already getting to where they were stumbling, suffering from dehydration. And finally, they could go on no longer. And so Ishmael has to lay down. So she has him lay down under a shrub in some shade there in the wilderness. And she's like, he's going to die. I don't want to watch my son die. So she goes about the distance of a bow shot. I have no idea if they're talking like English longbow. I mean, that's that's a good distance. But she went some distance away so that she wouldn't want to watch him die that closely. And so she walked away. She sits down and she just starts crying. And she starts weeping. And I can't imagine the turmoil that she was going through now. She's like, everything was fine. He was the heir. Now he's going to die of thirst in the wilderness. My son. And remember, back then, that's how they saw eternity, a life in eternity, was through their descendants. She's like, this is it. We're done. We're gone right here. It's over. And she starts crying and weeping. But in verse 17, it says, and God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. God understands authority as well. And God understands who's in charge. And whenever something happens, Ishmael is crying out to God. But God doesn't answer Ishmael. He answers Hagar, who has authority over Ishmael. Goes to Hagar and says, what are you crying about? Don't be afraid. For God has heard not your crying, but the crying of your subordinate, your son, the boy over there underneath the shrub that you think is dying. He's calling out to God. You're over here crying. He's calling out to God. God hears him. So don't worry. Fear not. For I will make of that boy a great nation. And in verse 19, it says, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So, God goes to Hagar and says, what are you crying about? What are you worried about? Don't worry. God has heard the boy. Sometimes whenever we cry out to God, God doesn't answer us directly. He goes to the person who can fix it and answers them because of our prayer. Don't ever think that because God doesn't answer you directly, he's not hearing you. God hears you. And he'll answer, sometimes not in a way you expect. See, I can imagine that Ishmael was sitting there crying out to God, going, God, I need water. I expect you to show up and give me water. But instead, God goes to Hagar and says, Hagar, You need to go give your son a drink. And that's the way it works. And so then she was so distraught about her boy, and she was so confused and in turmoil about her son dying that she didn't even see a well of water that would have solved all the problems. How many times are we so close to the problem that we can't see the solution? And God has to show up and open our eyes so that we can see the water, so that we can see the well. Because that well, God didn't miraculously make it appear. It was there the whole time. She just didn't see it. And God revealed it to her and said, don't worry, I'm going to make of the boy a great nation. Kind of, look over there. And she lifted her eyes and looked and saw the well. She went and filled the skin with water, gave the boy a drink. He revived. They survived. Not only did they survive, it says he grew and became strong. In this picture, whenever I was a kid, I always imagined that the boy was just a little infant, and she had to lay him down underneath the shrub because she was carrying him. 14 years old. And it says that the angel says, go and lift up the boy with your hand. Not pick him up, lift him up, And so the boy went and he grew and became a man. And where did she get a wife for him? From her home nation. Remember, they were down south near Egypt, the land of the Philistines. Egypt is here, the Philistines are here, and then Israel's up here. So you have to see the geography. He came out of the promised land, has been dwelling in the land of the Philistines. She went south into Beersheba, the wilderness of Beersheba, and there's Egypt right there. So she goes home and gets him a wife. And that's the beginning of the Arab nations. And so she takes a wife for him from Egypt. And so we kind of shift gears and go back to Abraham in verse 22. And it says, and it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will also do to me in the land in which you have dwelt. So God has just healed Abimelech and all his nation. Right? So they're sitting there, and I can imagine there in the land of the Philistines, all of a sudden, Abimelech goes, Abraham's still living in our land. We know that we can't do anything against him because then God will kill us. Maybe we should go ahead and just make a peace treaty with him. Maybe we should go ahead and make sure that his descendants don't kill off our descendants, because if he's this powerful, I can imagine his descendants are going to be like that too. They're going to be close to God. And so we want to make sure that our descendants don't die. And so they go down. He grabs his commander of his army, and they go down to Abraham, and they say, we see that God is with you, whatever you do. Whatever you do prospers. That's the blessing of Abraham. When God blessed Abraham, he said, basically, anything you touch is going to prosper. Tell you, whenever you're praying for blessings for your family, pray for the blessings of Abraham. Because it doesn't matter what they do, they'll be prosperous. And he says, God is with you in all that you do. And also notice that people will notice when you're following God close enough that everything you do prospers. And they'll want to get in on it. They'll be like, just let me be your friend. Because we know if we're next to you, we get some of that showers that just bounce off of you. He says, now therefore swear that you will not deal falsely with me or my offspring. Isn't it interesting that this is the king of the Philistines? And later on, if you keep reading the Bible, the story says that the Philistines attacked Israel. Not Israel attacked the Philistines. The Philistines had dominion over Israel at one point. Throughout their history, the Philistines caused problems. From before they had a king to the end of it. David had to fight with the Philistines, for goodness sakes. All through that time, it was the Philistines. And yet here's the king of the Philistines saying, please don't kill us. And Abraham answers in verse 24. Abraham said, I will swear. Then in verse 25, then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set by themselves? And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. Therefore, he called that place Beersheba, because the two of them swore an oath there. So Abraham says, I'll go ahead and swear it, but you got to give me back my well. And Abimelech's like, what are you talking about? He says, your servants have stolen, your people, a well that I dug. Your people have stolen it from me. This is interesting. This entire chapter, whenever I was reading it this week, really popped out the understanding of chain of command and who's in submission to who. See, in the wilderness, the wells were life. They were the source of life. Abraham dug a well. Abimelech's men came and stole it, so Abraham could not use it. He didn't attack back. Wars have been fought in the wilderness areas for wells of water. Abraham didn't fight back. But when opportunity came, he looked at Abimelech and said, your people have stolen my water. You want me to swear a peace treaty? You've just taken away my life force. And Abimelech immediately says, I don't know who's done this thing. I've never heard of it until today. You can have it back. It's yours. You dug it, it's yours. So Abraham gave him sheep and oxen, which is tradition for the whole peace treaty thing. Gave them to him, and then he set 7 young lambs by themselves. Just separates them out. And Abimelech looks over and he says, what's up with the 7 lambs? And Abraham says something that I find interesting throughout the Bible. He says, these lambs saw me dig that well. You're going to take them. They're going to be my witness in your presence that I dug this well. Throughout the Old Testament, it's the weirdest thing. Whenever Jacob leaves Laban, right? They make a peace treaty. Jacob sets up a rock. And he says, this is a witness. It's heard everything we say. This is our witness. If anyone questions, this is the witness. That we have made a peace treaty. And what does Laban do? He says, that's a good idea. Everyone who's with me, get a rock. And they make a big pile of rocks. And he said, this pile of rocks is witness. Things that can't testify. But you know, there are some scientific studies that claim that the air, as well as rocks and things like that, actually absorb our voice. And if we can just tap into it just right, we can hear everything that was said in the presence of that rock. And they're studying, trying to find out how to pull those frequencies back out of those inanimate objects. And it's weird. But they're setting up rocks. And these lambs that have no ability to speak. He says, these saw me dig the well. They're my witness. You're going to take them with you. Don't eat them. Don't slaughter them. They're my witness. And Abimelech says, okay. And they leave and they go their way. And so they call that place Beersheba, which is well of the oath. They made the promise. In fact, they named the well that Abraham said, I dug this well, your people took it from me. They said, let's call it Beersheba now. Here is where we're going to swear this oath. And so that's where they were. They're my witness that I have dug this well. Then in verse 32, at the end here, it says, thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. That's El Olam. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. The interesting thing is that for a year, about a year, he's been in the land of the Philistines. Actually, at this point, being that Isaac was already weaned, possibly 5 to 6, 7 years. And it says he stayed there even longer. He was not in the promised land. Like, actually, if you think about it, he was. Because God said from the river of Egypt to the Tigris, or the Euphrates, not the Tigris. And so that's a pretty big area. He was in it, but he was way down south instead of what we call the promised land now, the land of Israel. But he stayed there. And if you remember in the book of Hebrews, it talks about Abraham going from nation to nation as strangers and pilgrims. He didn't have a permanent place to pitch his tent. And that's what he lived in the land of the Philistines for many, many years. Not up in Israel near Jerusalem proper, but down near Egypt, in that area. So it's interesting to think about where Abraham stayed most of the time. In fact, Isaac was not born up in Jerusalem, in that area. He was born way down south near Egypt, in the land of the Philistines. And so we're going to see how this kind of translates through, and the birth of Isaac and how Isaac moves on from here. And the way God fulfills his promises, even when they seem impossible. We may laugh and doubt at first, but eventually we end up laughing in joy because God did the impossible. He is the everlasting God, El Olam. And that's who he is. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the example of how to behave, how to work through our faith, how to understand submission and authority, and how to work through that and understand that we need counselors. We need people to talk to us. As men, we need our wives to show us the way. We may be the head of the household, but we don't stand alone, Lord. Lord, I thank you that I don't stand alone. Father, I pray that you would help us to understand that if you said you were going to do something, you've given us promises, then you're going to do it. You're going to fulfill your promises as you've said, just like you did with Isaac and Sarah. Lord, because that's who you are. You're the everlasting God. You don't forget because you're always there. You're always with us. You never turn away. You never leave us. You never forsake us. You are the one who's always there. Lord, and we put our trust and our hope and our faith in you. Father, take us from here. Help us to be good witnesses everywhere we go and in everything we say this week, and bring us back safely next week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.